I'd like to invite you to cast your minds back just a matter of weeks now to the 14th of March of this year. Because on the 14th of March of this year, the International Criminal Court secured its first conviction. Thomas Lubango Diallo was convicted by the International Criminal Court for, and I will quote this precisely so that I don't miss the context of this conviction. He was found guilty of having committed the war crimes of enlisting and conscripting children under the age of 15 years and using them to participate actively in hostilities in Ituri, a district in the eastern province of the Democratic Republic of Congo, between September 2002 and August of 2003 in the International Criminal Court's first landmark trial. Lubanga's defense has the right to appeal the guilty verdict. The trial was also noteworthy, not simply because Lubanga was the first to be charged by the court, the first to be charged and the first ultimately to be convicted, but it was noteworthy as well because it was the first instance in this kind of exercise in international law in which victims themselves were provided the opportunity to participate in the trial and to offer what can only be described in our terms as victim impact statements. It's a remarkable thing that this has actually occurred, despite the innumerable flaws that have been identified primarily by civil society. Procedural flaws, the simple question of the time that this process took, and this has raised question by many in civil society as to the old principle of justice delayed being justice denied. Nevertheless, it has demonstrated finally this year, in the 10th anniversary of the actual establishment of the International Criminal Court, that it is capable of bringing in a verdict and a conviction, and sends out a notice that the human community has reached a stage in its evolution where our intent is to ensure that no one is above the law. Now, it could in fact be argued that that has been a symbolic reality of a human community going back to that point in the Roman Republic when the tables of the law were first hammered up in public, denoting that, in theory at least, no one was above the law. Now we are in some measure able to demonstrate that in practice this intent can perhaps become a reality. It's an extraordinary thing to see this and to compare it to the experience, for example, of Nuremberg and the distance which we have traveled during the course of, let's say, 3 generations by almost any calculation. My late uncle, who died just in August last year, was a witness, not a witness, but rather an observer at the trial of Hermann Göring in Nuremberg. And here we are a mere 60 to 70 years later, seeing a new international instrument that I don't think any of us who've had involvement in the civil society realization of the International Criminal Court ever really believed we'd see. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, then, gives us a structural basis to begin to seek justice around issues of human rights, not just in Africa, but, at least in theory, around the world. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I want to give you an image which is not an image of courtrooms, but a very different kind of picture of life on the ground in Africa, which illustrates some of the great challenges, pain, and grace that comes out of the people who are actually affected in the context of Africa during these post-colonial years. In the higher country outside of Rakai in Uganda, if you travel far enough, you will come to Shambwa, a clearing. It's up a road. I'd never find it again, I'm sure, but back in 2003, a number of us who were part of the church leaders' mission to Uganda and Tanzania that was mentioned had an opportunity to visit the family which occupied this particular Shambwa. A Shambwa, or clearing, that consisted of a large dwelling hut and a couple of smaller huts for particular purposes, one of which was as a midwifery center, because the principal person in this particular context was a woman named Zoe. Now, Zoe didn't speak English. Zoe had to be translated. Her story had to be translated by one of our guides. She was a remarkable person. When we arrived and pulled into the Chambois, she greeted us with this wild ululation, this enthusiasm that indicated a welcome such as which I suspect none of us had ever experienced before. She was delighted we were there because she wanted us to see what life could be in her particular part of the world, or her particular part of her world. Zoe had 19 children. They ranged from about 2 years in age to about 20 years in age. And these were her children in the sense that she had become their de facto parent. They actually were the children of her 4 sons and her 4 daughters-in-law, all of whom lay in shallow graves just adjacent to the Chambois' largest hut or dwelling hut. They were lovely kids, absolutely wonderful kids. The majority of them had been outfitted in school uniforms, and they had a tremendous possibility for the future. They sang for us, they greeted us warmly. Zoe's pride in them and their love for them was absolutely evident. And Zoe herself was facing enormous challenges. At the time, she had a growth that extended roughly from the base of her neck up along the side of her face, a massive thing. To give you the good news, it turned out that this was happily resolved by medical intervention some months after we left there. But her presence, including the presence of one young woman who had walked all through the night to give birth to her baby boy in the early hours of the morning, with Zoe assisting as midwife, gave us a vision of the world that, well, let's simply say that standing next to this mud block hut and being introduced, as we were, to this young woman with her hours-old newborn is probably as close to the Bethlehem of Luke's gospel as I'll ever get, or we'll ever get anyway. So as we were leaving, people were just terribly moved. How could you not be moved at a moment like this? One of our number asked our interpreter if he thought Zoe would like us to pray for her. That's not such a bad thing, after all. Prayer, well, prayer sometimes, after all, works, I suppose. And it's, generally speaking, not a bad thing, and often a powerful thing to know that someone is praying for one. And in my own case, at least, prayer may not have any effective remedy, but if it doesn't change the world around me, it usually changes me. However, this was one of my rare moments of inspiration. It certainly wasn't a moment of insight. I'm not quite this clever, I don't think. But before we prayed for Zoe, I turned to the interpreter and said, "Do you think perhaps we could take a moment and ask Zoe what she'd like us to pray for?" Well, it struck me as a no-brainer after I'd said it, but, you know, the kind of thing, well, you never know afterwards if you changed your mind. But nevertheless, Zoe was delighted not only to be prayed for, but she was delighted to be able to tell us what she would like us to pray for. There were 3 things. There were 3 things. She wanted her children to grow up to be good citizens. She wanted to live long enough, because she had no idea what this thing was, to see them grow up to be good citizens. And then there was a longer pause, and she said she heard that there were people up in the north who were having some troubles, and she really hoped that we'd pray for them. For those of you who follow YouTube, which I don't, you may be familiar that the troubles involve Joseph Kony, and the kind of excitement that's been generated by that as it went viral just a short while ago. Now, I want to just take Zoe's story for a minute and lay it beside the International Criminal Court. Because the International Criminal Court is, unquestionably, an invention of the North and of the West. This is not a bad thing. It simply adds a layer of complexity. Because the International Criminal Court and the responsibility to protect doctrine, which in a sense is a companion piece to the International Criminal Court, are both intended to, in the end, be preventive measures from government and civil society in order to try and prevent the kinds of horrors that were described to us by Pamela and that Zoe had heard of happening in the north of Uganda, and that some of us have seen, if not in the moment, then at least the evidence of shortly after. The challenge is that the structural elements of the International Criminal Court are very often seen as being imposed in a manner that is paternalistic by Western governments, based on standards around human rights that are more theoretical than practical. The on-the-ground reality of people like Zoe is that the folk we met with, at least, lived in a world in which spirit moved as in a manner as real for them as the presence of peacekeepers might be to a more European-oriented people. The key to moving forward seems to be not to go for an either-or, but a both-and approach. The structural clearly is going to be necessary, and yet the kind of approach that Zoe would embody in terms of prayer, kindness, and peacemaking, which sometimes suggests that justice might be achieved in the manner of an operation succeeding while the patient dies, is the kind of challenge that we're facing. An effort to develop a way of recognizing a dynamic tension that allows for the possibility of something more than a purely juridical or theoretical approach to dealing with the kind of horror that occurs not only in Africa by any means, but in parts of Asia, in parts of the South Pacific, certainly in parts of Latin America. Now, it's going to be extremely difficult to achieve that, to try and say that we wish to uphold not only the language of human rights, but the effective measures that will allow justice seeking to come to some sort of fruition. The difficulty seems to be, in many respects, how to avoid constantly looking at trade-offs that are too simplistically, too facilely approached. There is a clear argument that peacemaking and justice seeking can be contradictory one to the other. Those who might wish to achieve peace are concerned that the prosecutions that might be developed through processes of the International Criminal Court and responsibility to protect will be inimical to establishing peace and to allowing for the kind of quiet and peaceful home building that Zoe and her 19 kids are attempting to accomplish in Ashambwa upcountry from Rakai. The key thing, though, that makes the International Criminal Court, and for that matter the responsibility to protect doctrine, which, as I say, is very much a part of a whole process, is that there is a civil society buy-in that, generally speaking, seems to go unmentioned when people talk about the International Criminal Court. Now, this civil society buy-in is described in some measure in Erna Paris's rather excellent little book, The Sun Rises Slow, which tells the story, the behind-the-scenes story of the development of the International Criminal Court. The ICC was accomplished first as treaty in 1988, and in fact in 2002, not primarily because governments gathered together to ensure that a highly technical legal document in multiple volumes was actually achieved. The International Criminal Court has come into existence principally because of civil society coalitions, and one particular, and that is the coalition for the Civil Society Coalition for the International Criminal Court, the CICC. The CICC has over 2,500 civil society organization members and is still a functioning and very highly, regularly consulted body that deals with the ongoing concerns of the International Criminal Court and how it might become more effective, because all the problems that Pam laid out concerning the court, including the innumerable number of potential arrests and potential convictions, the glacial speed at which it needs to move so the due process is actually undertaken, is problematic. But the buy-in from civil society is extraordinary. And when it is observed by some, often Westerners, that the concept of an international criminal court is a paternalistic intrusion by Western society, the countervailing argument to that is that while members of this International Criminal Court coalition do include large, primarily Western organizations along the lines of Greenpeace, Amnesty International, the Red Cross, the majority of civil society supporting members are actually small, tiny, rural groups of lawyers and physicians and teachers and clergy and others, like the support organization in the DRC itself. So what has made this international instrument unique is this kind of civil society appropriation of it. This is now becoming a part of the reality of the responsibility to protect, too, with the establishment in January of 2009 of the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect, the ICR2P. For those of you who are interested, I've placed a substantial amount of stuff on top of the piano, and you're not only welcome to it, but I would plead with you to take it so that I don't have to carry it back to Winnipeg. Now, the one other element that I'd like to speak about before we turn things into the Q&A, though, is focusing particularly on attempts to find a point of intersection between the structural mechanisms of both governmental and civil society, two of the three legs of the milking stool that was described to us by Lowell. And that point of intersection comes with an initiative that is almost certainly doomed to failure, at least on the short term. The initiative goes back now some 6 years and is a project of Senator Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, and it is the Child Soldiers Initiative. The Child Soldiers Initiative, or CSI, sounds at first blush almost preposterous. The concept behind the CSI is simply this: Senator Dallaire is committed to eliminating child soldiers as effective weapons platforms. As he points out, a child soldier is really not a bad deal, you know, if you're a warlord. It only takes about 7 to 10 years to grow one instead of 18 to 20. And given the extraordinary capacity of arms manufacturers to make use of plastic, witness both the AK-47 and for that matter the Uzi, a child can wield a weapon of massive devastation with as great ease as an adult can. And a child can be intimidated and held in thrall in a variety of ways, not necessarily available to warlords if they're having to deal with adult soldiers. And some of the stories that you may have heard or read are painfully accurate. Winnipeg is home to, in one high school alone, about 3 blocks from where I live, 100 students from the sub-Sahara, all of whom were either child soldiers or war-affected children. And the challenges that these kids face still with issues of dreams, understanding the spirits of their victims coming back to haunt them, are quite extraordinary. And you're absolutely right, Pam. The religious is being largely underestimated, although General Dallaire has taken that into consideration. So Romeo's concept is relatively simple. He says, let's find something else to give the warlords and free up the kids. And the ideas, well, they range from the somewhat terrifying to the fairly reasonable. There's a possibility, for example, of buying the kids out. Because let's be very clear, sometimes children are child soldiers for good practical reasons. There are no resources. What else is left to them? It's actually not unlike the reasons why many kids, particularly new Canadian kids, find themselves in gangs in the inner cities of Canadian communities. On other occasions, the thought has been raised that perhaps kidnapping the kids is one way of dealing with it. Buying the kids out from the warlords, not simply providing the children with resources. Another suggestion, a particularly provocative one, I must say amongst my Mennonite friends, is providing better armaments to the warlords to trade for the kids. And still others involve, quite frankly, the simple use, I use the word guardedly, the simple use of force to go in, clean out the warlords, take the kids, and the mechanisms, the responsibility to protect procedure, third pillar, which is to say if you have to use the pointy end of the stick, the authority is there to do it. And then the procedures of the International Criminal Court, which of course is what has happened in the case of Lubanga. The intriguing thing so far is that there has yet to be an actual field trial of this. The CSI has had 3 design components. The first occurred in August of 2006 and was, as far as I know, the first occasion on which regular and irregular military, former child soldiers, war-affected soldiers, governmental and non-governmental aid organizations, politicians, diplomats, and religious leaders came together for several days at the invitation of Senator Dallaire in order to begin talking about what those strategies to draw child soldiers away might include, to develop a kind of toolbox, if you were. The second phase was to be held a little later in 2007 and was undertaken in the context of Africa itself, and that was a strategic analysis of what might work. It was a kind of a situation analysis, not actually a field application. And then the hope was that at some point, if enough money could be raised, that an actual in-theater attempt to achieve some of these goals would be undertaken in the DRC. There's still some time and some money away before that actually occurs. But here's the thing, and I suppose all that I really wanted to say can be boiled down to this one particular observation. We are not going to be able, as a human community, to deal primarily or solely with structural, governmental, or civil society strategies to address the questions of human rights and particularly massive human rights abuses. Neither are we going to be able to deal solely with questions of influence through religious leaders and others on the ground, nor solely through prayer. Rather, we are going to have to constantly find, as General Dallaire has been seeking, ways of compromise in which these two elements of the human experience, the structural and, if you like, the salvific, can come together almost on a case-by-case basis to attempt to address these most extraordinary challenges. But find ways we absolutely have to do. One of our last days, it was my turn to ride in the front of the bus, so to speak. In this case, the front of a Toyota Land Cruiser, with a young man named Jeremiah. And we talked as we drove this time in the hill country above Bukobe and Lake Victoria in the sunset, these gorgeous bright red roads that make Prince Edward Island look positively pale. And at one point, as we talked about our families and our children and things that had meant and still meant much to us, he turned to me in the gathering darkness and he said, Jacobo, answer me this question. Why is it that you Europeans are so unlucky, and we Africans are so lucky, rather, and we Africans are so unlucky? Now, how do you answer something like that? You know, how do you answer something like that? Not just with a conference like this one, no matter how excellent it is, of course. Not just with structural suggestions around courts and responsibility to protect, and not only with our good wishes and our prayers and an open hand and an open heart. I suspect that perhaps the only way to answer someone who asked a question like that is simply to say that whatever might have been attributed to luck in the past can certainly not be left to luck in the future, and that there is no one person nor community in the human family who can be deserted by any other part of the human family, and that our task is to understand truly what solidarity means. Thank you.